It begins, as so many stories do, not with a scream, but with a whisper. In forgotten archives, in the yellowed corners of brittle newspapers, and in the hushed recollections of families who still live in the towns where it happened. There exists a name almost no one dares speak aloud: Crowley. For generations, the Crowley Dynasty was little more than a shadowy rumor, a specter flitting at the edge of America's proud history. But when fragments of their presence began resurfacing, old land deeds, faded family portraits, and testimonies that refused to stay buried, their reputation returned with them. And with it came the chill, as if something long sealed away was disturbed once again. If you love dark forgotten history, consider subscribing for more, and tell me, where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it where you are? Because as you listen to this story unfold, you may find yourself glancing at the clock more than once, wondering if the hour has anything to do with the shadows that follow the Crowley name. The first rediscovery came in the form of a ledger, one uncovered in a crumbling courthouse basement in Virginia during the 1920s. The ledger was water-damaged, half illegible, but it contained a list of families taxed for land ownership in the early 1800s. Among the Jeffersons, the Whitmans, and the other respected names of rural America, one stood out in blackened ink: Crowley. The handwriting was darker, as if pressed harder into the page. And where other names came with neat notations of acreage and livestock, the Crowley entry bore only one word beside it sealed. What could that mean? Land sealed from use or sealed away for reasons no one dared record. That single word ignited curiosity among a handful of amateur historians. But curiosity about the Crowleys has always come at a price. The more researchers pried, the stranger things became. An archivist in Richmond, a man named David Harlan, reported to colleagues that every time he tried to trace the Crowley line through census data, he hit a blank wall. Entire pages had been torn out. Or worse, altered names blacked over, ink chemically burned into the parchment, Harlan joked, in letters that survive, that someone wanted the Crowleys to be erased not just from memory, but from reality itself. Within 6 months, Harlan suffered a breakdown. His peers whispered he began screaming in the night about children with hollow eyes. He left his position and was never heard from again. Was that coincidence? Or consequence? These early threads of rediscovery were tantalizing because they hinted at something more than just a family forgotten. Why would official records documents meant to preserve history be deliberately destroyed? Why would the Crowley name evoke such discomfort that clerks would rather torch the past than leave it intact? And most importantly, what did the Crowleys do to deserve such obliteration? The whispers grew darker when a trunk surfaced in an estate sale outside of Baltimore in 1933. Inside were photographs unlike any other from the 19th century. Families usually posed stiffly in their best attire, cherishing the chance to freeze time on delicate plates of glass. But in the Crowley photographs, faces were obscured. Children stared not at the camera but somewhere behind it, wide-eyed, as if something loomed just beyond sight. In one, a girl clutched a doll so tightly her knuckles appeared white, but her expression was that of horror, not play. Most disturbing of all was a family portrait: father, mother, 3 children taken in front of what looked like a decaying chapel. All 5 figures were pale, blurred at the edges, as though their bodies resisted being captured at all. The photograph bore no names. Just a word scrawled on the back: Crowley. Collectors debated whether the photos were hoaxes. Some suggested that the chemical process had degraded, creating ghostly effects, but others felt a deeper wrongness. Why were all the Crowley images shot at night? Why did every background show ruins, twisted trees, or fog curling unnaturally? No other family photographs from that period looked so staged or so haunted. As these pieces leaked into public consciousness, the Crowley story transformed from curiosity into warning. Old-timers in rural Virginia began speaking more openly about what their grandparents had told them, that the Crowleys were not like other settlers. They avoided daylight. Their children were born with strange marks, and on certain nights, neighbors would hear chants rolling from the Crowley land, low and rhythmic, like waves pounding against a hidden shore. Livestock would vanish. Wells would sour. And if a stranger passed by the Crowley property, they might see lights moving through the trees, lights that left no footprints when followed. So, what was the Crowley Dynasty? Truly, were they farmers? As the ledgers suggested, or were they keepers of an inheritance America was never meant to acknowledge? The answer lies tangled between folklore and fact. Even in the 20th century, when modern historians sought to publish serious papers on the subject, their work was mysteriously halted. Drafts vanished, printers refused contracts, and in one case, a manuscript was reported stolen from a professor's locked study. He swore he'd never spoken of it to anyone but his wife. The pattern is unmistakable each time the Crowleys creep back into view. Something or someone moves to drag them into the dark once more. But perhaps the more chilling question is this: if the Crowley name has been hidden with such force, what horrors would we uncover if we knew the full truth tonight? As we begin peeling back the layers of their story, ask yourself how much of history is what we are allowed to know, and how much is what others have worked to erase, and if the Crowleys represent America's most forbidden legacy. What does that say about the foundation this country rests upon? What do you believe the word sealed meant beside their name, a land cursed and locked away, or a family oath that bound not just their property, but their very bloodline? The Crowley Dynasty did not begin in America. Their story, if the fragments of whispers and rare surviving documents are to be believed, stretches back to the Old World England, Ireland, and perhaps further still into continental Europe. They were not merely another family chasing prosperity across the Atlantic. No, the Crowleys carried something with them, something older than the colonies themselves, something steeped in ritual and secrecy. To understand their American chapter, one must first examine the roots buried in shadow overseas. The earliest mention of the name Crowley appears in parish records from rural Ireland during the late 1600s. Strangely, the records are incomplete, as if whole generations were obscured. Where other families boasted long genealogies and carefully noted baptisms, the Crowley line seems to materialize suddenly, without parents, without ancestry, as though they had been placed there rather than born. Villagers told stories quietly, and only after a drink, that the Crowleys arrived one night on horseback, accompanied by a procession of wagons carrying objects wrapped in black cloth. No one saw where those objects were stored. But not long after, an abandoned stone chapel outside the village began to show faint candlelight at night. Was it coincidence that soon after, several infants in the village were born with strange deformities, eyes too pale, or limbs slightly twisted, or that livestock miscarried, crops withered, and storms battered the valley in unnatural sequence? The priest at the time, Father Amon, wrote bitterly in a surviving journal, "They have made a covenant, though I dare not speak of it. Their prayers are not to our God." He died less than a year later, his body discovered at the foot of the ruined chapel with his throat blackened as if seared from within. From there, the Crowley name drifted in and out of records across Europe, always associated with places where something uncanny took root. In Bavaria, in the early 1700s, a Crowley widow supposedly inherited a monastery that had fallen into disrepair. Within months, villagers reported hearing chants from inside at midnight, though the monastery was said to be abandoned. Travelers noted seeing black-robed figures walking silently down the roads, accompanied by children who never spoke. In France, a Crowley cousin was accused of heresy for experimenting with medical procedures involving cadavers, an act that blurred the line between science and blasphemy. Though arrested, he was mysteriously released, and the judge presiding over his case resigned soon afterward, citing unnameable nightmares. The patterns suggest more than coincidence. Wherever the Crowleys appeared, rumors of forbidden rites followed. Were they students of hidden knowledge, practitioners of something passed down through generations, a craft too dangerous for open society? Some folklorists argue they were descendants of old pagan orders, families who preserved rituals of sacrifice and communion with the unseen. Others go further, suggesting ties to secret societies that promised influence in exchange for loyalty to powers not of this earth. What is chilling is how consistent the descriptions remain across regions. The Crowleys are said to have hosted vigils under the cover of night. Fires would burn in places no fire should, and voices chanting in strange tongues echoed against the hills. Children born into the family were often regarded as marked either by physical difference or by eerie insight. Some could predict storms. Others could name a villager's illness with uncanny precision. These stories circulated not as legend alone, but as lived memory, as warnings passed between generations. So, why would such a family uproot themselves and sail to the New World? Was it simply the lure of land and freedom? Like so many settlers, or was it the growing suspicion, the tightening noose of Europe's religious and political authorities, that drove them across the sea to escape scrutiny, or to find a place where their practices could continue without interruption? America, in the late 1700s, offered fertile soil for both new beginnings and old secrets transplanted into unfamiliar earth. It is said that before the Crowleys departed Europe, a ritual was held, one not recorded but whispered about in villages long after. Witnesses claimed that on the eve of their voyage, the ruined chapel where they had once been seen was set aflame, but the flames burned cold, casting no warmth. Black smoke rose straight into the sky and did not disperse, lingering for days. When the villagers dared approach, they found the altar intact, a symbol etched into its stone surface. That symbol, curiously, would later be reported on headstones in Virginia where the Crowleys settled. What could the ritual have been? Was it a farewell or a summoning to guide their journey? Some speculate it was a sealing a pact renewed before crossing into a land that did not yet know their name. And if a pact was renewed, with whom was it made? The more one digs, the more elusive the truth becomes. Scholars who attempted to trace the Crowleys in European archives often reported missing documents, burned parish logs, or inexplicable denials of access. A professor at Oxford who compiled the most comprehensive Crowley file in the 19th century died before publishing it. His notes, kept by a student, suggest that he believed the family had never truly been human in the ordinary sense, but vessels for something older, wearing human blood as a mask. When America opened its shores, the Crowleys stepped aboard. The voyage records list them not by name, but as Group of Five, surname obscured. They traveled with chests heavy enough to sink a small boat, guarded at all times. Never opened in public. Other passengers avoided them. One account from a fellow traveler speaks of children who never smiled, who stared too long at the waves, as though they were listening to voices beneath the sea. And so, when their ship touched American soil, the Crowleys arrived not as immigrants, but as carriers of something else, something that had already haunted Europe for centuries. They stepped onto new earth, but their roots remained in the shadows they carried with them. The question lingers, did they leave Europe to escape persecution? Or did Europe drive them out to rid itself of their influence? And more disturbingly, what did America inherit when it welcomed the Crowleys to its shores? When the Crowleys finally set foot upon American soil, they did not arrive with the fanfare of other immigrant families seeking a fresh start. Their ship docked quietly, their names conspicuously absent from official records. No announcement, no entry in the town registries, only scattered mentions from those who later remembered their presence. The Crowleys chose Virginia, a land rich with forests, rivers, and shadows deep enough to conceal anything. According to what little remains in oral tradition, their homestead was unlike the cabins of neighboring settlers. While most families built small wooden homes near clearings, the Crowleys seemed to vanish into the woods. Locals claimed they chose a patch of land where even animals avoided grazing, a hollow where fog clung low even in summer. Their dwelling was erected quickly, but strangely wood-blackened, though it was freshly cut. Windows far too narrow for any use, and a roof that sloped unevenly as if designed for something other than human comfort. Neighbors who tried to welcome them were turned away with polite but distant smiles. The Crowleys rarely traded, rarely mingled, and when they did, they spoke with accents that shifted strangely, not quite Irish, not quite English, as if borrowed from elsewhere. Then came the disappearances. At first, it was livestock sheep vanishing from pens, hens gone without a trace, wolves, the neighbors said at first, or foxes, but tracks revealed nothing, and fences were found intact. Soon, it was travelers. A merchant reported that his brother had failed to return after venturing near the Crowley land. Search parties combed the woods, but found only broken branches and a faint smell of smoke. Then, an unsettling rumor spread that cries had been heard in the night. Human cries, carried on the wind from the direction of the Crowley homestead. One farmer, a man named Eli Turner, claimed to have followed the sound of chanting late one evening. He described lanterns glowing among the trees, forming a circle of light where shadows moved rhythmically. He could not see faces, but he swore that the figures tall and cloaked were singing in a language he could not recognize. Then he saw what he thought was a child, lifted high above the circle. Before the lanterns abruptly went dark, Turner fled, and though he told his tale in hushed tones at the local tavern, no one dared confront the Crowleys. He moved away within a year, abandoning his farm. Children in nearby villages were warned never to wander into Crowley territory. Some defied the warnings, daring each other to approach. One story tells of 3 boys who ventured too far and never returned. Another insists that only 2 were lost, while the third came back mute, unable to speak ever again. When asked what he had seen, he could only draw symbols into the dirt shapes that some later recognized as similar to markings found carved into Crowley gravestones decades afterward. Yet, strangely, the Crowleys were never charged or even openly accused. Perhaps it was fear that kept their neighbors silent. Perhaps it was something subtler the Crowleys seemed to exert an influence beyond their numbers. Local magistrates dismissed complaints without investigation. Priests warned their congregations not to spread unfounded tales. Even hunters avoided their woods, though they never admitted why. It was as though an invisible hand pressed upon the region, urging silence, enforcing ignorance. What little evidence remains of the Crowleys' first settlement survives in fragments. A burned page from a church record notes certain families not to be included in rolls, their rites unfit for God's house. Another, a letter from a woman to her sister in Pennsylvania, describes strange gatherings at the turning of the moon. They light fires not for warmth, but for worship. I hear drums and voices, though no instrument is seen. The children bear marks upon their skin, swirls like serpents coiled. I beg you, do not speak of them. Even architecture seemed to bear their signature. Foundations of stone were discovered years later beneath the soil, arranged in patterns that did not align with ordinary houses. Some believe they were part of an underground chamber, others that they marked the boundaries of ritual space. Locals avoided them, saying compasses spun wildly when brought near. And when archaeologists much later attempted to excavate, the dig was abandoned after multiple workers fell ill, claiming to see figures standing in the tree line, watching silently. The Crowleys thrived in their isolation. Their fields grew without blight, their animals never sickened. Strangers noted how the family always appeared well-fed, dressed better than their neighbors, though no one ever saw them purchase supplies. Where did it all come from? Some whispered of shipments arriving by night on hidden roads, wagons draped in black cloth, echoes of the tales from their European past, but prosperity came at a cost to the land around them. Wells near their property turned bitter. Crops in neighboring farms began to fail mysteriously, despite good weather. Trees close to the Crowley border blackened and twisted, their bark scarred with patterns resembling human faces. Was it disease or something else entirely? Could the earth itself reject them? Or had they bound it with oaths only they could understand for decades? The Crowleys' first settlement remained a place of dread, and though generations passed, the stories persisted. Children dared each other to step onto Crowley soil, and some claimed to have seen faint lights moving through the woods, long after the dynasty had shifted elsewhere. Even today, old maps sometimes carry a curious marking over that region, a shaded circle, labeled simply sealed. Why would a family arrive in a new land and immediately bury themselves in secrecy? When opportunity was everywhere for those who worked hard, what compelled them to gather at night, to whisper in tongues forgotten by all but themselves, and most unsettling of all, what happened to those who strayed too close to their hidden circle of lanterns? The Crowleys had planted their roots in America, and already the soil trembled beneath them. Whispers about the Crowleys were unsettling enough when it came to their midnight rituals and strange disappearances, but the most disturbing stories always circled back to the children. For in every generation of the dynasty, it was said that the youngest bore marks of something not entirely natural, proof that the family's oath, whatever it truly was, had etched itself into blood. Neighbors described infants born with pale, almost translucent skin, veins visible like dark rivers beneath the surface. Some came into the world with eyes that seemed too old, too knowing, staring past midwives as if they recognized something no newborn should. A few carried physical deformities, a sixth finger, a twisted foot, an ear missing entirely, yet the Crowleys never considered these defects. Instead, they treated them as signs. Every child, no matter how marked, was seen as chosen. One account from a midwife in Virginia survives only through second-hand retelling. She claimed that, during the birth of a Crowley child, the room grew unnaturally cold, the candles sputtering though no wind was present. When the infant finally cried, the sound was unlike any she had heard, sharp and resonant, almost like a chant. The family thanked her, paid her generously, but warned her never to repeat what she had seen. She left the settlement that very week and reportedly told her husband, "That child is not theirs alone. It belongs to something else, beyond their strange births." The Crowley children grew with uncanny abilities. Villagers muttered about a boy who could predict rain days before clouds appeared, and a girl who seemed to know who in the village would fall ill long before symptoms showed. These might have been dismissed as coincidences, except that the children themselves claimed the knowledge came from voices in dreams. Dreams, they said, that were not their own. As they aged, their oddness became harder to ignore. Some children did not play the way others did. They preferred wandering the woods at dusk, speaking softly to trees, or sitting by wells, gazing into the water for hours. Teachers who briefly attempted to educate them complained of strange disruptions. One recalled how a boy scrawled unfamiliar symbols into the margins of his slate, lines that twisted into spirals she could not erase. When she tried, the chalk would smear, staining the wood black. She quit soon after, insisting she had seen the symbols move on their own. Worse still were the rumors of prophecy. A young Crowley girl, no more than 8, allegedly predicted the death of a local farmer by describing in detail how his horse would throw him into the river. Days later, the event occurred exactly as she said. When questioned, she shrugged and told her mother, "They showed me Who were they? No one dared press further. Neighbors began to avoid the children altogether. If one approached, adults would cross the street. Mothers would clutch their own sons and daughters tightly. Yet the Crowleys seemed content with the isolation. They encouraged their children's odd behaviors, hosting private ceremonies in which the offspring were brought before the entire clan. Witnesses, always from a distance, never too close, reported hearing chanting. Rhythmic and solemn, followed by cries that could not be explained as joy or fear, but something in between. These were known as the Oath Nights. It was whispered that each child, upon reaching a certain age, was bound by an oath passed down through generations. What that oath entailed remained a mystery. Some believed it was a vow to protect the family's secrets at all costs. Others suggested something darker, that the children pledged themselves not to their parents, but to the same unseen force their ancestors had courted in Europe. A pact sealed not with ink or blood, but with the soul of the child itself. The most chilling tale centers on a boy named Nathaniel Crowley, born around 1835. From a young age, he was regarded as different even among his kin. His eyes, described as black pits, unsettled even hardened men. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried weight, often describing things that had not yet happened. One neighbor swore Nathaniel told him, "The corn will rot before harvest, months before blight struck the fields." Another said the boy approached her with a dead bird in his hands, whispering, "It will fly again when the moon is red." The bird, she claimed, disappeared from her table that very night. When Nathaniel reached 12, the Crowleys held an oath ceremony larger than any before. Lanterns lined the forest edge, drums beat steadily, and the boy was led forward, his face painted with symbols no one recognized. Those who dared watch from afar reported that he did not resist. Instead, he raised his hands to the sky and recited words that did not belong to any known language. After that night, Nathaniel was treated not as a child, but as a figure of reverence within the family. Yet, within 2 years, he vanished completely. His name was never spoken again. His belongings burned. To this day, some say the Crowleys did not lose him at all, that he was taken as fulfillment of the oath. Other children suffered stranger fates. Some fell ill suddenly and died young, though their bodies were never buried in churchyards. Instead, the Crowleys interred them on their land, in graves marked with spirals and crescents. On certain nights, locals reported hearing the sound of children singing from those burial grounds, faint and dissonant, as if the earth itself carried the voices upward. Why did the Crowley children inspire such dread? Were they merely products of isolation? Raised with strange traditions and whispered into believing they had powers, or were they truly vessels of something unnatural, chosen by their bloodline to continue a pact their ancestors had forged centuries earlier? Each tale leaves behind only questions. Did the oath protect the Crowleys, allowing their dynasty to survive when so many others perished in war, famine, and disease, or did it consume them, one child at a time, binding each generation tighter until escape was impossible? The story of the Crowley children lingers in the region even now. Locals still whisper about the marked ones, and some claim their descendants walk among us, hiding their lineage behind new names. And if that is true, then the oath has never been broken. If the Crowley children were the most unsettling part of the dynasty's living memory, then the structure at the center of their land, the chapel, was the most enduring symbol of their legacy. It was not a church in the ordinary sense, though the family always called it that. To outsiders, it was the forbidden chapel, a place where no neighbor ever stepped willingly, and where every whispered rumor seemed to converge. Descriptions of the building vary depending on the decade in which they were recorded, but certain details remain consistent. The chapel was constructed of dark, weathered stone, unlike the wood cabins of the settlers. Its roof sloped steeply, designed not for practicality but for some archaic aesthetic no one in Virginia had ever seen. Most unsettling were the windows tall, narrow slits that seemed less for light and more like watchful eyes. Even in daylight, they remained dark, absorbing the sun rather than reflecting it. The chapel stood at the edge of the Crowley homestead, half concealed by twisted trees. Its bell tower contained no bell. Instead, a hollow structure loomed above, where locals swore they saw figures standing in silence at odd hours of the night. Some claimed a faint humming noise emanated from within, so low and constant that it made the ground beneath their feet tremble. No official records described the chapel's construction. No deed listed it. No mason claimed the work. It was simply there, as though it had always existed. Old folk in the region insisted the Crowleys had not built it at all, but found it an ancient ruin long hidden in the forest, which they claimed for themselves. Yet others argued the family had raised it quickly upon arrival, using stone transported by night. Whatever the truth, the structure became the heart of their rituals, and the heart of their fear. Neighbors who dared pass close enough described hearing chanting within. Sometimes the voices were low and singular, sometimes layered and discordant, as if dozens spoke at once. On rare nights, screams punctuated the chants, sharp, brief, and abruptly silenced. When daylight returned, the forest floor bore strange markings, circles burned into the earth, spirals carved into tree bark. Stories of the forbidden chapel often mention baptisms, but these were no ordinary Christian rites. Instead of water, witnesses whispered of bowls filled with black liquid, too thick to be natural. Infants were said to be dipped into it, lifted out not with blessings but with chants in languages unknown. Those who heard the sounds swore they did not belong to any human tongue. The Crowleys insisted these ceremonies bound their children to something greater, ensuring the dynasty's survival. One chilling account survives from a runaway servant who briefly worked in the Crowley household in the 1820s. She claimed that, on the night of a full moon, she was summoned to bring linens to the chapel. From behind the door, she heard a child crying, followed by the sound of many voices rising together. When she peeked through the narrow window, she saw a circle of figures in black surrounding a stone altar. A child was placed upon it, writhing as a knife hovered above. The servant fled and never returned. Years later, when recounting the tale to her grandchildren, she insisted the child was not harmed but changed, rising from the altar with eyes glowing faintly white. The altar itself became a subject of fearful fascination. Local folklore claimed it bore carvings older than the Crowleys' time, symbols etched deep into stone that could not be erased, spirals, crescents, and shapes resembling eyes. Some argued they were pagan remnants from native tribes, though elders of those tribes denied it, saying such markings had never been theirs. Others suggested the altar came from Europe, transported piece by piece in those mysterious wagons the Crowleys brought across the sea. If true, that meant the forbidden chapel was not merely a building, it was a vessel, carrying something across oceans. Curiously, when outsiders pressed too close to the truth, the chapel seemed to strike back. A traveling preacher once tried to hold a sermon denouncing the Crowleys, calling their chapel a gate to hell itself. Days later, his small church burned to the ground. The fire left the wooden cross intact but blackened, warped into a shape eerily similar to the spiral carvings described on the Crowley altar. The preacher fled the county and never spoke publicly again. Children from neighboring farms often dared one another to approach the chapel at night. Most ran away screaming before reaching the door. But those who got close reported strange sensations, air that vibrated in their lungs, whispers that seemed to crawl into their ears. One boy claimed he touched the chapel's stone wall and felt it pulse faintly, like the skin of a living thing. By the late 1800s, the forbidden chapel had fallen into disuse, at least publicly. Travelers described it as crumbling, its roof sagging, vines covering the walls. Yet locals warned each other never to dismiss it as abandoned. Lanterns were still seen flickering inside. Sometimes, smoke rose from the chimney, though no firewood was ever delivered. And most disturbing of all, fresh symbols continued to appear on the altar long after the Crowley family line seemed to vanish. Who carved them? If no one lived there anymore, the Forbidden Chapel stands as more than a relic of one family's dark past. It embodies the secrecy, the rituals, and the oath that bound the Crowleys generation after generation. It is a place where faith was inverted, where children were dedicated not to God, but to something nameless. And though time and ruin have worn its stones, its memory persists. Locals still avoid the path that once led to its door. Hunters refuse to set traps nearby. Some say birds never perch upon its roof, as if even nature recognizes the space as wrong. So, what truly was the Forbidden Chapel? A monument to superstition, a house of worship for a faith America was never meant to see, or, perhaps most chillingly, a doorway still waiting to be opened again. The history of the Crowley Dynasty was not only obscured by rumor and fear, it was actively erased. In every town, every archive, every dusty church ledger where their name should have appeared, there are gaps. The story of the Crowleys is not merely one of dark rituals and unsettling children. It is a story of deliberate silence, of pages torn away and ink drowned in acid. And that, perhaps, is what makes their legacy most unnerving. What family commands such fear that entire communities would rather destroy their own history than preserve the truth? The first hints of this erasure surfaced when researchers in the late 19th century began piecing together land deeds in Virginia. One archivist, a meticulous man named Robert Maynard, noted with frustration how every mention of the Crowleys in county records was either crossed out or marked void. Some documents were mutilated edges burned, ink smudged beyond recognition, as though someone had taken deliberate care to obliterate a name. In one case, a deed book had been sewn back together, leaving an obvious gap of missing pages. Maynard wrote in his notes, "The Crowleys existed. I have proof of it in whispered accounts and half-vanished signatures, but someone has been at war with their memory." Weeks later, Maynard died suddenly of a stroke, though colleagues muttered about the strange, terrified look that remained on his face even in death. Church records tell an equally disturbing story. Baptisms, marriages, funerals, rituals meant to anchor families and community seemed to bypass the Crowleys entirely. Priests admitted, in quiet letters, that they had refused to sanctify the family, calling them unfit for God's role. Yet those same priests' journals often contain cryptic warnings. One, Father Dillingham of St. Paul's Parish, wrote, "I have destroyed the register. Let it not remain. If others inquire, let them be told that there was never such a family here. Better a lie preserved than a truth loosed upon the world." Within a year, Dillingham vanished during a storm while traveling between parishes. His horse was found tethered, but the man himself was never seen again. Universities and historians who pursued the Crowleys fared little better. A professor at William and Mary collected oral testimonies from the descendants of families who once lived near the dynasty. His manuscript draft, nearly 200 pages, was stolen from his study the night before he intended to present it. The lock was not broken, his windows not forced. Yet every page was gone. He told his colleagues the theft was not of this world and abandoned his career shortly thereafter. He never again spoke of the Crowleys. Even in government archives, their presence seems poisoned. Census records from counties where they resided show glaring absences. Pages list every family in order, then leap over the exact acreage known to have been theirs. Margins are smudged. Handwriting grows sloppy as though the clerk's hand trembled, and in one peculiar entry, a single word is scrawled across an otherwise blank page sealed. That same word appeared in earlier European references to the Crowleys, as though the family carried with them not just their lineage but an official decree their lives were not to be written down. But who enforced such silence? Was it the family themselves, bribing or threatening officials to keep them invisible? Or was it something larger, an unseen force ensuring their history remained veiled? The strangest cases suggest the latter. In one courthouse fire in the 1850s, nearly every box of records was recovered except the collection labeled C. Those particular files were reduced to ash, though the blaze had not touched the shelves around them. The judge declared it an accident. Locals whispered otherwise. Legends also persist of those who tried too hard to remember. A genealogist in the 1920s supposedly traced her own ancestry back to the Crowleys. Days before publishing her findings, she fell into a coma. Her last written words were scrawled on the back of an envelope. They don't want their name spoken. She never awoke, and her work was destroyed by her grieving family. The vanishing records serve another purpose. They invite speculation. If so many documents were erased, what was in them? Birth defects, murders, land purchases involving sacred or forbidden sites, or perhaps evidence of a pact the kind no one wanted written in ink for future generations to uncover. The few surviving scraps only deepen the unease. A fragment of a will, charred and half-burned, refers to the land we are sworn never to surrender. Another note from a parish clerk complains they came again, demanding the logs. I told them the bishop forbade it, but they left with the book regardless. I feel watched. And then there are the whispers of entire trunks of papers, locked away, not destroyed, stored in basements of courthouses where employees are warned never to open them. Every historian who stumbles across the Crowley Trail is forced to ask who benefits from their erasure if they were nothing more than a family of eccentrics. Why the extraordinary effort to blot out their existence? The energy spent to destroy their memory suggests fear. Fear that their truth, once exposed, would spread like contagion. And perhaps that fear is justified. After all, history is built on the written word. Without it, families fade, stories dissolve, and legacies are lost. Yet the Crowleys refuse to disappear completely. No matter how many records vanish, their shadow lingers in photographs, in ruins, in tales passed from parent to child. The erasures themselves become evidence of something larger. The harder history tries to forget them, the more potent their presence seems. Imagine this. What if the Crowleys themselves orchestrated their invisibility, binding their name not to paper but to whispers, ensuring that their power remained oral, mutable, untraceable? What if, in destroying the records, they were not victims but participants guiding their own myth so that they could exist forever in rumor rather than die in the truth of ink? It leaves us with one final, unsettling question. When a family is written out of history, do they vanish, or do they grow stronger in the silence, thriving in the spaces between words where no one dares to look? The story of the Crowleys might have remained little more than hushed folklore and missing records, if not for what happened with their inheritance. For dynasties, property and wealth are not simply material, they are the bones that hold generations together. And when those bones are broken or corrupted, secrets bleed out. The Crowleys' inheritance revealed more about their inner world than any official document ever dared. In most families, wills are straightforward, land divided, belongings dispersed, debts cleared. But with the Crowleys, nothing was simple. Surviving fragments of their estate papers reveal cryptic language, phrases that seem more like incantations than legal declarations. One half-burned document, retrieved from a courthouse fire in the 1880s, contained instructions written in a mixture of English and Latin. The dwelling shall pass to the one whose blood has not thinned. Let none unmarked approach the chamber, lest the oath devour them. What chamber was this? Researchers speculate it referred to a hidden room within the Crowley homestead, or more likely, beneath it. Several accounts from the 19th century mention cellars far larger than any house would require. Neighbors who were invited inside for business reported stairways descending deeper than expected, corridors carved into stone, and doors that seemed to lead nowhere. Yet the family never allowed outsiders past a certain threshold. Those who pushed too far were swiftly escorted out. When a patriarch or matriarch of the Crowley line died, disputes over their estate often turned violent. Brothers accused sisters, cousins fought cousins, each claiming to be the rightful heir. But curiously, the conflicts almost always ended in sudden death. A would-be inheritor might fall ill overnight, bleeding from the nose until they expired. Another drowned mysteriously in a shallow stream, though she had been a skilled swimmer. One was found hanging from a beam in his own barn, his face frozen in a look of indescribable terror. And with each death, the inheritance passed quietly to another, until only one remained. It seemed as though the dynasty tolerated no rivals, only a single successor. Rumors of the black inheritance grew during the mid-19th century, when townsfolk whispered that the Crowleys' wealth was not natural at all. They did not trade much, nor did they farm extensively, and yet they always had coin, always had fine cloth, always had horses. Some said they drew gold from hidden chambers underground. Others believed the Forbidden Chapel held offerings from outsiders, people who paid to join their rites in exchange for unnatural prosperity. A few went further still, suggesting that the inheritance itself was cursed, that each heir received not money but a burden, an unseen chain binding them to the family's dark covenant. The most chilling stories, however, came from those who claimed to see the hidden rooms. In the 1870s, after a Crowley widow died, a group of men attempted to inventory her estate. They discovered a concealed door behind her bedroom wall. Inside was a chamber lined with shelves, each stacked with jars sealed in wax. Some contained bones, small ones, likely animal, though some appeared disturbingly human. Others held dark liquid, thick as oil, that emitted a foul smell even through the seal. At the center of the room stood a chest, locked tight. The men reported the discovery to the county clerk, but by the next morning the chest was gone, and the chamber itself bricked up. None of the men ever spoke of it again in public. Even more unsettling were the wills that included stipulations about burial. One Crowley matriarch wrote that she was not to be buried in consecrated ground, but within the circle, under the mark. Locals later found a grave on Crowley land carved with the familiar spiral symbol. When curious boys tried to dig it up, their shovels broke against something hard only a few inches beneath the soil, something not stone, but metallic, humming faintly as they struck it. Terrified, they fled. The grave remains untouched to this day. Inheritance disputes also revealed how deeply the family distrusted outsiders. When courts tried to intervene, records show the Crowleys argued that the blood decides. On more than one occasion, they refused to accept a ruling unless it matched the outcome of their own secret process. And somehow, mysteriously, judges always relented. Some suggest bribery, others intimidation. But could it be that the family wielded influence beyond human means? One tale, passed down quietly in Virginia, speaks of a Crowley heir named Lydia. She was young, barely 20, and the last surviving child after her siblings died in suspicious accidents. When she inherited the estate, neighbors expected her to marry quickly and pass the land into another family. Instead, she retreated into the homestead, rarely seen. At night, people heard her singing from the chapel, her voice joined by echoes that could not have been human. A year later, Lydia herself was gone. The property was found abandoned, yet the hearth fire still burned, and food sat uneaten on the table. Her will, discovered weeks later, contained only one line, "I leave it all to the unseen." The black inheritance is not merely a story of wealth, but of power. Whatever the Crowleys passed from one generation to the next was not just property. It was knowledge, ritual, and a connection to something deeper than soil or coin. Perhaps that was why records of their estates were so often destroyed. To expose the truth of what was inherited would be to expose the nature of the pact itself, and this raises an unsettling thought if even now, fragments of the Crowley line survive under new names. Does the inheritance continue? Do descendants still receive cryptic wills, still unlock hidden chambers, still hear the oath whispered to them in the dark? What is an inheritance if not a chain binding past to present, and living to the dead for most families? That chain is made of memory and love. For the Crowleys, it was forged in shadow. By the time the 19th century drew toward its close, the Crowleys had become less a family and more a rumor that clung stubbornly to the soil of Virginia. Yet their absence from polite conversation was not accidental. It was deliberate. The Crowleys were not only avoided by their neighbors, they were actively suppressed by the people who should have recorded their existence. Politicians, clergy, even local businessmen all seemed to share an unspoken agreement: the less said about the dynasty, the better. One might expect scandal to be shouted from the rooftops, exposing the family's strangeness to ridicule. But that is not what happened. Instead, the Crowleys were carefully folded out of the public record, their story smoothed over like a wrinkle in the fabric of history. America, it seems, was afraid of them, not just afraid of their rituals, but of the questions those rituals raised about the foundations of the nation itself. Evidence of this fear appears in small, telling fragments. Local newspapers that thrived on gossip never once published an exposé on the Crowleys. The few times their name did surface, the editors were quick to issue retractions. A notice from 1872, for example, briefly mentioned strange nocturnal activity on the Crowley land. The following week, the paper printed an apology, insisting it had confused the property with another. Curiously, the editor resigned the next day. His replacement never again allowed the name Crowley to appear in print. Clergy were equally complicit. Priests who spoke too loudly about dark houses in our midst often found themselves transferred to faraway parishes. Some disappeared entirely. The pulpit, usually a place of bold moral proclamation, grew silent on the subject of the Crowleys. Parishioners were told not to ask questions, only to pray. The implication was chilling. The church itself feared contamination. Politicians behaved no differently. Land disputes involving Crowley property were routinely settled behind closed doors, with no explanation given. State officials avoided comment, though privately some admitted unease. A senator from Virginia was overheard in 1889 telling a colleague, "It is better to bury the name than to bury another town." His meaning was unclear, but the tone suggested he believed acknowledging the family could bring real danger not just to individuals, but to entire communities. Why this silence? Was it cowardice, or was it a recognition that speaking of the dynasty gave them power? Folklore scholars argue that the Crowleys understood something most families did not, that fear itself is a currency. By ensuring that their neighbors lived in dread, they secured invisibility. The less people spoke of them, the more untouchable they became. Yet fear leaked through, no matter how hard officials tried to suppress it. Farmers refused to plant near old Crowley land, even when desperate for fertile soil. Roads were rerouted to avoid passing too close. In one case, a schoolhouse was relocated because parents would not allow their children to walk the wooded path that skirted the edge of the Crowley estate. These were not accidents of geography, but deliberate acts of avoidance, rooted in a terror so profound that silence became the only survival strategy. Even into the 20th century, echoes of this silence remained. Oral histories collected from Appalachian families contain peculiar warnings. Don't follow lights in the woods. Or, if you hear children singing where no children live, keep walking. Such sayings are often attributed to generic superstition, but many of them trace back to areas once associated with the Crowleys. It is as though the dynasty had become a template for rural fear, absorbed into cultural memory yet never named outright. Some theorists suggest the Crowleys themselves encouraged this silence by cultivating an aura of dread. By allowing only the faintest whispers of their rituals to slip through, they ensured that no one dared challenge them directly. Others argue the silence was enforced by something greater, an unseen pact between the dynasty and institutions of power. Could it be that politicians and clergy alike benefited from Crowley influence, and in return shielded their name from exposure? A curious case from 1901 lends weight to this theory. A historian attempted to publish an article on the family in a regional journal. Though his research was thorough, detailing inheritance disputes, missing records, and testimonies from locals, the issue never went to print. The publisher abruptly shut down operations, citing financial strain, though business records showed no such trouble. The historian himself vanished a year later while traveling in the mountains. The surviving draft of his article ends mid-sentence. The Crowley line persists not in name, but in blood, and those who would reveal them. The final words trail off, as though interrupted. It is tempting to dismiss such tales as paranoia, the invention of people desperate to make sense of an absence. Yet absence itself speaks loudly. When a name is erased across so many platforms, legal, religious, cultural, it suggests a fear deeper than superstition. America's silence around the Crowleys was not passive. It was protective. The nation behaved as if mentioning them might summon something better left undisturbed. This raises questions that linger even today. Was the silence an act of mercy, shielding ordinary people from truths too dangerous to know, or was it an act of complicity, allowing a dynasty with forbidden practices to thrive unchecked if institutions conspired to suppress the Crowley legacy? Then perhaps the real horror is not what the family did, but what America allowed them to do. And so the Crowleys remained ghosts in their own time, present in the landscape, absent in the record, feared in the mind. Their name, like a forbidden word, was spoken only in whispers, because to speak too loudly was to risk inviting their shadow closer. What happens when the society chooses fear over truth, and what grows in the silence left behind by the dawn of the 20th century? Most believed the Crowley dynasty had finally faded into myth. Their chapel crumbled, their homestead abandoned, their name absent from all respectable records. For a time, it seemed as though the silence had won. But blood has a way of carrying what memory tries to erase. And in the case of the Crowleys, their bloodline proved more enduring than anyone dared imagine. Stories of descendants began surfacing in the strangest of ways. A midwife in Kentucky, attending to a birth in 1912, noted that the infant bore a faint spiral-shaped birthmark on its chest. When she mentioned it to the mother, the woman grew pale and insisted she say nothing further. Months later, the family moved away without explanation. Only years later did whispers connect them to the Crowleys of Virginia through a distant maternal line. Such coincidences might be dismissed, if not for how often they reappeared. In small towns across Appalachia, children with odd gifts began to appear. A boy in West Virginia who could recite details of storms before they struck. A girl in Tennessee who drew symbols in the dirt, the same shapes found carved into the Forbidden Chapel's altar. None bore the name Crowley, but locals, remembering the old stories, muttered it beneath their breath. The blood has not died, they would say, shaking their heads. Some descendants tried to live quietly, suppressing whatever inheritance lingered in their veins. But blood, like shadow, has a way of leaking through. A farmer in North Carolina confessed to his neighbors that his grandfather had been a Crowley. He claimed his own children woke at night speaking languages he could not recognize. They would draw spirals on the walls, their fingers blackened as though dipped in ash. Terrified, he sent them away to relatives. No one ever saw them again. The farmer himself was found hanged in his barn weeks later, a crude spiral carved into the wood above his head. There were also cases of those who embraced their lineage. A woman in New Orleans during the 1920s reportedly held gatherings in her home where candles burned with unnatural flames blue, then green, then black. She introduced herself as Lydia Crow, though neighbors suspected Crow was only a shortened form. Guests at her gatherings claimed to feel sudden chills, as though unseen hands brushed their skin. Lydia vanished abruptly after one of her ceremonies, leaving her house abandoned. Inside, investigators found walls covered in symbols eerily similar to those on Crowley gravestones in Virginia. Even in cities, where superstition was often mocked, the bloodline left its traces. A child in Boston was studied by physicians after demonstrating strange fits during which she spoke in voices not her own. One doctor noted in his report that the girl invoked the name Crowley again and again, though her family insisted no such name existed in their ancestry. The case was never published in medical journals. The girl died young, her family relocating soon after. The persistence of the bloodline raises unsettling questions. If the Crowleys truly vanished, why did echoes of their traits, birthmarks, visions, rituals continue to surface across generations and states? Some researchers argue that the family scattered deliberately, abandoning the Crowley name but carrying its legacy in secret. Others suggest the pact binding the dynasty was not confined to land or chapel, but to the blood itself. If so, no matter how far descendants fled, the oath would find them. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence comes from genealogical research conducted in the 1970s. An amateur historian tracing her family tree discovered connections to both Virginia and Ireland, with a branch labeled only C. As she dug deeper, she uncovered marriage records linking her line to a forgotten Crowley daughter who had taken another surname. Her notes describe feelings of dread, as though the discovery itself had called something forth. She abandoned her research abruptly. Writing in her diary, the name is gone, but the blood remains. And it remembers. The legend of the Crowleys refuses to die because it does not depend on written history alone. It lives in the bodies of those who bear it, in whispers that rise unbidden in the night. In children who see what they should not, blood is a vessel. And for the Crowleys, that vessel carried not only life but inheritance, pact, and curse. What does it mean? Then, if their descendants walk among us still, could they be neighbors, co-workers, strangers on the street whose family histories conceal a forbidden name? Do their children dream of spirals, of voices chanting in unknown tongues, and if the oath still binds them? What will happen when a descendant finally chooses not to hide but to embrace the legacy fully again? The thought is chilling. For if the bloodline remains, then the Crowley Dynasty is not a story of the past. It is a story still unfolding, in shadows we have yet to recognize. And that leads to the final, most haunting question: does blood ever truly forget, or does it carry memory, silently, until the right time comes for it to awaken once more by the late 20th century? The Crowley Dynasty had seemingly disappeared into the folds of history, their name erased from ledgers, their lands parceled out or reclaimed by forest, their chapel reduced to stone fragments half swallowed by roots and moss. And yet, even as their physical presence decayed, the weight of their legacy remained. It was not gone, only buried alive, waiting, whispering. The ruins of the Crowley estate still stand in fragments across Virginia. Farmers tell of stumbling upon foundations hidden beneath thickets, where stones bear marks too deliberate to be natural. Spirals, crescents, and faint grooves like human eyes. Hikers sometimes find themselves wandering off trail, drawn by what they describe as a pull, when they come upon moss-covered walls or the remnants of doorways that lead nowhere. Many report the same sensation, silence so heavy it presses against the ears, as if the woods themselves are holding their breath. Local folklore insists the dynasty is not gone at all, only buried in place, sealed beneath soil, stone, and silence. Some say that deep beneath the earth, chambers remain intact, filled with objects too dangerous to unearth. Strange metallic humming is reported by those who dig wells in the area. A few even claim to have uncovered tunnels, quickly collapsing, that reveal walls carved with symbols identical to those on the forbidden chapel altar. Whatever was once hidden may still be there, alive in its own way, waiting to be uncovered. Genealogists who try to trace families in the region often run into curious obstacles. Records appear, then vanish. Entire branches of family trees end abruptly with the word unknown. Locals insist that certain surnames, ones that emerged mysteriously in the late 1800s, are nothing more than Crowleys under new guises. When pressed, they grow defensive. "We don't speak of that blood," one old woman told an interviewer in the 1980s, "because blood never stays buried." What is most unsettling are the sightings. Even in recent decades, people claim to see figures near the ruins at dusk, tall shapes moving silently. Lanterns glowing faintly between the trees. Hunters tell of stumbling across gatherings of children in the woods, their eyes reflecting unnatural light before vanishing into the dark. Photographs taken near the old Crowley land often distort. Faces blurred. Shadows stretched into grotesque shapes. Skeptics dismiss these as tricks of light, of imagination. But those who know the history whisper otherwise. The dynasty is not gone. It waits. Some researchers believe the Crowleys ensured their survival by embedding their bloodline into America itself, by scattering across the country, by marrying into unsuspecting families. They dissolved their identity into the broader population. And yet, they left markers, birthmarks, visions, unnatural sensitivities. The inheritance continued quietly, dispersed like seeds. The question is not whether Crowley descendants exist today, but how many and whether they know who they truly are. If the oath was real, then it was not tied to land or chapel, but to blood itself, which means it cannot be buried. It can only be carried forward, generation after generation, until the time comes when it is renewed. Some whisper that the dynasty's pact was not about wealth or secrecy at all, but about endurance. To survive through erasure, to thrive even in silence, to never truly die. And so, the Crowley legacy lingers like a pulse beneath the earth. Every ruined wall, every vanished record, every whispered story is a reminder that some things are not forgotten, they are buried alive. Perhaps the silence was never protection but concealment, a way to shield the rest of the world from something that still breathes in the dark. What would happen if those ruins were excavated fully? If the chambers beneath were opened? If the chest at the center of the inheritance was pried apart? Would it release the truth at last, or something far worse? And what if a Crowley descendant, alive today, chose to seek out that truth for themselves? Would they awaken not just a legacy, but a covenant that has never been broken? Because here lies the most terrifying thought of all: the Crowleys may not be a story of the past, but of the future. Their dynasty may not be gone, but waiting, buried not in death, but in anticipation. The silence, the erasures, the fears, perhaps all of it was less about destroying the family than about containing them. But nothing buried alive stays silent forever. And so we reach the end of the Crowley story, or rather, the edge of it. For stories like this never truly end. They linger, unsettled, like a shadow in the corner of the room, The dynasty's name has been erased, its chapel left in ruins, its land abandoned. But silence is not the same as resolution. Silence is a mask, and masks are meant to hide what continues beneath. Even now, descendants may walk among us. The child who dreams of voices, the neighbor who avoids mirrors, the family whose records vanish just when you begin to trace them. If the oath binds the blood, then the Crowleys are not gone, they are hidden, waiting for the time when their legacy is called forth again. And this is the question I leave with you. What do you believe really happened? Were the Crowleys a cursed family erased for good reason? Or were they guardians of something too dark for America to face? Did the nation bury them out of fear or out of complicity? Perhaps the answer lies not in the ruins or the records, but in the silence itself. For what we refuse to name, we allow to grow stronger in the dark. If this story has unsettled you, know that you are not alone. And if you crave more tales history tried to erase, subscribe for more. But be warned once you start listening. You may find that history begins to whisper back. Continue watching here